Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope this Zoom meeting finds you well. My name is Christina Burke, and I am a second-year creative writing MFA nonfiction student. I've got some gnats, so don't mind the little waves. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Breakout Writer series featuring Jamel Brinkley, moderated by Black Mountain Institute Shearing Fellow Bonnie Chau. Bonnie Chau is a writer from Southern California. She earned her MFA in fiction and translation from Columbia University and has received fellowship and residency support from Kundiman, Farm Nebraska, the American Literary Translators Association, and Vermont Studio Center. She is the author of the short story collection, All Roads Lead to Blood, that has been described as brilliant and arresting, and a masterful entry into the conversations of women and people of color and the issues they face. Our guest tonight is fiction writer Jamel Brinkley, who has been described as an important new voice, a fully formed and brilliant writer, and a major new voice in American fiction. His latest work is a collection of 9 stories set in Brooklyn and the South Bronx. It explores the charged, complex ties between men whose mistakes threaten their relationships with friends, lovers, and family members. It reflects the tenderness and vulnerability of Black men and boys whose hopes sometimes betray them, especially in a world shaped by race, gender, and class, where luck may be the greatest fiction of all. Brinkley is a finalist for the National Book Award, the Short Story Prize, the John Leonard Prize, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. He is also the winner of a Penn Oakland Award. His writing has appeared in A Public Space, the Paris Review, Plowshares, Gulf Coast, the Threepenny Review, Glimmer Train, American Short Fiction, The Believer, and Tin House, and has been anthologized twice in the Best American Short Stories. We are lucky to have here with us today, through the grace of technological advancements, the winner of the 2018 Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence and author of A Lucky Man. Please welcome Jamel Brinkley in conversation with Bonnie Chau.
Thanks so much, Christina. And thank you everyone out there for being here with us tonight, virtually. So just very quickly, the format for this event, we are going to be here for an hour, and we're gonna start with Jamel reading a bit from his collection, A Lucky Man, which is fantastic, and everyone should buy it. I think there's a link in the chat to the writer's block where you can buy that. If you already have it, buy it for a friend. And then after his reading, we will talk for about 30 minutes or so, and we will have the last 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So if at any time you think of a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom right of your Zoom screen, and feel free to type your question in there. Okay, so Jamel, will you read for us?
Yes, thanks. Before I read, I just want to say thank you to the Black Mountain Institute, everyone there. Thank you to Christina for that introduction, and thanks Bonnie for doing this event with me. I'm just going to read for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to read essentially the end of a story called Wolf and Rhonda. In some ways, men like him were familiar to her. Many of them existed, well-dressed, successful men who were nonetheless unhappy and often alone. She thought he would be just another one of these men, someone she could spend a pleasurable night with and never think about again. But this man, he had the heaviness of desperation. She couldn't help but notice the particular burden he carried. His voice had changed. Now, as he alone furthered the conversation, he sounded angry, disgusted. A tone she recognized in the voices of men vibrated from his throat. Along with the tone, his body was growing tense. The man sitting next to her had been a boy she once knew. If she tried, she could remember that boy, but she didn't. She wouldn't. She refused to. When it became clear that she wouldn't answer him or respond to his insults, he looked at the sky and resumed his talking, repeating himself endlessly, repeating his frustrated pleas. She stared across the street at the line of parked cars and then raised her face to the breeze. The air tasted like rain, far away but approaching. She raised her head higher and higher still, until its angle was the same as his. He kept going on about his memories, laying them out like an arrangement of stones. His words piled on themselves in a strange rhythm. They formed walls that he could take shelter in. So be it, she thought. So be it. She opened herself, just for a little, to the man who had been a boy she refused to remember. Listening as he went on and on about some distant day, a weightless speck of time. Then, thinking of where to go next, she reached through a gap that had yet to be closed off by the past. For a few moments, she interlocked her fingers with his. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm so glad you read that story and that ending, because I actually wanted to start by talking a little bit about your story endings. In previous interviews, you've talked a bit about your writing process and kind of about stories that start with a seed of a memory or a character or voice, and how the endings are discovered along the way. And so I was looking at the various endings of your stories, and I kind of noticed that a lot of them are these moments of simultaneous intimacy or physical proximity. For instance, in this ending, Rhonda takes Wolf's hand, right? Or they're holding hands. But at the same time, she's like, leading up to that, she's so far away. You know, it's like she doesn't owe this guy fucking anything, right? And so there's this juxtaposition in a lot of the story endings between intimacy, but also a sort of expression of aloneness or loneliness, or kind of, it's like the ultimately the distance between people. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that. Like, how do you know an ending feels right or is striking the right chord?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. I guess I'll say a few things. One is that, you know, when I'm working on a story and I'm figuring out what the story is and I'm approaching the ending, then I think I've found the ending. One thing that I have to do is to sort of go back to the beginning of the story and make sure that the beginning of the story is the same story that it is at the end of the story, you know, because you're getting smarter about your own work as you proceed. And usually, you know, what's at the beginning is so nebulous and vague. And it takes until the ending for me to find the depth and the density and the richness that I want. And I have to kind of comb that through the entire story, because, you know, I think an ending is, you know, sometimes we can talk about endings as though they're their own separate things, but an ending is sort of the result of the story, right? So it's sort of, you can't really separate it from the story. and have to make sure that everything that happens in the story contributes to that ending. The other thing I would say with regard to the rest of your question, I'm really interested in questions of intimacy. I'm really interested in questions of privacy. And I'm really interested in these kinds of hybrid emotional moments, if that makes sense. Where just because two characters are pressed close together doesn't mean that they have surrendered their privacy. Doesn't mean that they've surrendered their boundaries. In fact, that might be the moment where their boundaries are the most heightened, the most strengthened. And I just think there are these really interesting moments in life where it's hard to name them with just the kinds of emotional words that we tend to have on hand, happy or sad or angry or what have you. What's more interesting to me are what happens when you meld those emotions. And I kind of want my endings ideally to reside in these sort of hybrid spaces of emotion.
Oops, I just realized I thought I was muted and I was not. That reminds me of let me see, this is in your interview with Electric Literature, you talk about the failure of language. This is a quote. "I do think I'm always trying to push toward deeper feelings that are difficult to verbalize. Literary sentences and poetic lines can make, or somehow emotion words show themselves as lacking. Literary sentences and poetic lines can make language do things that, as commonly used, it isn't very good at." And I was wondering do you ever feel that even literary language sometimes fails? I guess this is what we're all striving to do, but what do you do when you feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think part of the reason why writing remains of interest to us as artists is because we're constantly striving to say what can't be said. It's almost like a mathematical asymptote, you know? You can approach it, but you never quite get there. And I guess you could take that as frustrating on one hand, and it is, you know, if you're a writer, you know how frustrating it is to try to get words right or to make words do what you want them to do. But I guess the way that I like to think of it is like this. Even if my words ultimately fail, even if they ultimately don't reach as far as I want the words to reach, what I do hope and what I do think is possible because I've experienced it as a reader is that someone reading my words or reading anyone's words that are effective enough, the feeling that those words are trying to produce can be transferred into sort of the heart and the mind and the soul and the body of the reader. So it's almost as though you're kind of getting there and you hand the story over or the poem or the essay or whatever it is, you hand it over to the reader and the reader completes it. You know, the reader sort of makes that final leap in a realm that's kind of beyond language.
I like that answer. I mean, it's a hopeful one, right?
Yeah.
So you've talked about, I guess, the themes that, how themes in literature emerge in the aftermath of the writing. But that somehow these themes must be present as we're writing. Yeah. And I was just talking last night to a friend about this event, and I was like, oh, the event description says we're going to be having a conversation about tenderness and vulnerability. Like, fuck, what do I know about that? You know, what can I say about those things? And I guess my question is, I'm wondering if kind of looking backward and reflecting on these stories, which do touch upon those themes, do you feel like you have to have something figured out about these subjects in order to get to the point where you end up writing about them? Or do you think maybe you end up writing about something like vulnerability because you have questions about it? And does something happen in the process of writing? Do you come to a different understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's the latter for me. Um, like many writers have said before, I feel like I write because I don't understand something. I'm writing in an attempt to explore a question, not necessarily answer it, but just to explore it. And yeah, looking back, I don't know that the stories that I write have answered anything. But I do know that when I start writing a story, I feel like I don't know a damn thing. I'm writing sort of completely in the dark. I'm writing out of, some feeling, some obsession, some image, some voice, and I just sort of follow that and try to create a story out of it. Um, but yeah, I'm just exploring questions, and I think that that's sufficient for me. I don't feel like I need to come up with any answers. I think I need to solve anything. I just want to undergo an experience. Undergoing the experience of writing the story, but also undergoing the experience with the characters. And that feels sufficient.
Have you ever been surprised by some of the themes that readers have found in your work?
Yes. Yeah, I really have. I mean, one thing that happened, and this is completely out of my control, but when my book came out, it came out in the moment when Me Too was sort of a, really prominent. It was a big conversation, an important conversation. But when I was writing the book, that wasn't the conversation, right? So it was a huge surprise for me to hear that my book was about toxic masculinity, or even in some ways, and this is going to sound disingenuous because the book is all about dudes, but even when people were like over and over again saying it was about masculinity, period, not even toxic masculinity, I was like, oh, really? And then of course you look and you're like, well, yeah, okay. So I made certain decisions that make that reading inevitable. But for me, and I think I may have said this in other interviews or conversations, it's really more about intimacy and privacy and various kinds of love. Not even primarily romantic love, but I'm interested in how the love of your life, if there is such a thing, can be a friend or a family member, that kind of thing. Those really deep, deep relationships that you have with people that have nothing to do with like marriage or sex or anything like that. So those are the things I felt like I was really thinking about. But yeah, my book emerged at a moment when it was sort of swept up in a conversation that was already happening.
Do you ever feel that your desire to write about privacy is that ever like in conflict with just like being a writer and putting these stories out in the world?
Yeah, it's yeah, I think I know what you mean. It's sort of terrifying. And I think my experience was as the book was getting closer and closer to emerging into the world, I became completely terrified. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. People might read this. Do I want that to happen? And of course, part of the answer is yes, but another part of it is like, I think that I am laying bare some part of myself that I'm not sure I want to lay bare. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that just because of the way that the publishing world works, when you have something that comes out into the world and this, like all of a sudden, in a way, you're not a writer anymore. You sort of become a promoter of your own work, or a spokesperson for your work. You have to sort of step out from behind the work and speak for it, when all I ever really want is for the work to speak for itself. And there's something strange about that too, to sort of be estranged from your writerly self. Um, and I always try to keep in mind, there's this essay by Lance Samantha Chang. I think it's called "Writers Protect Your Inner Life." Basically, she's sort of urging us as we're sort of, becoming writers in the sense of publication, to not lose the sense of being private, being alone, being at your desk, reflecting, being quiet. And that's been really important to me because it can be difficult.
Yeah, I guess I sometimes, I probably wouldn't really, I'm like barely on Twitter, but I sometimes wonder if like, if I, for some reason, were to go like fully into it, if I would just have less to like think about or like write about, in my own work.
Yeah, I am on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm on all the things, not all of them, but the main ones. And you're totally right. I mean, I think there's a way in which these technologies and these ways of connecting and the speed of it can sort of sweep you up into a pace and a kind of speed of reaction that's like antithetical to writing. You just sort of get pulled into these various strands of conversations, like the fly on Mike Pence's head. And all of a sudden it's 3 hours later and you haven't written, or you haven't even thought in a way that's conducive to writing. So I think you're right about how challenging that is. And now you're making me think I should just quit Twitter.
But it's so fun, right? It's like, okay, so I'm gonna veer a little bit into talking about craft. So in a previous interview, you've talked about the importance that discussions that you've, I guess, been a part of in the Cambilio and Callaloo communities about how craft is not apolitical, that it's racialized, that's gendered. And I just feel like this is like a really important thing to think about and talk about as we kind of like think and talk about craft all the time as writers. And also, there's this book called The Racial Imaginary, where Claudia Rankin and her co-editors, they talk about how the imagination also is racialized, is not neutral, is political. So I'm wondering can you talk a little bit about how you think about this in terms of craft as a teacher also, and as a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually teaching a class right now on craft in the African-American literary tradition of fiction. And I was interested in doing that because I feel like sometimes when we talk about craft, it can get so abstract that it can sort of be these received wisdoms that have just been handed out. You don't even know where they came from. And, all of a sudden you're just like, show, don't tell. You're like, what? And so I was interested in just sort of looking at manifestations of craft in a particular tradition, a contested tradition, a varied tradition, but a tradition nonetheless. And the findings are kind of interesting. Like, it feels to me like so many of the roots of what we would call craft in the African-American tradition are coming out of, are very experiential. They're coming out of someone like Frederick Douglass saying that he hears the spirituals and they sound happy, but he knows the meaning is sad, right? Or they're coming out of Zora Neale Hurston seeing what the minstrel tradition has done to African-American speech, and then wanting to write a novel like Their Eyes Were Watching God, where Black speech is elevated instead of being framed in a way where you're basically making fun of it and laughing at it, right? They're coming out of experiences like James Baldwin. He has this wonderful essay called The Uses of the Blues, where he's talking about American innocence and this idea that an American exceptionalism, and that one of the the consequences of the idea of American innocence and the myth of American exceptionalism is this idea that you can come away clean. You can just sort of like, get off scot-free. That's craft. It is. And so I think like what I've seen so far based on, teaching this course is that there's so much craft in the tradition, but it doesn't look the way that maybe we expect it to look. And it's all coming out of experiences, the experience of enslavement, the experience of the fight for liberation, the experience of, Baldwin's point is a political point. So, the experience of making a point about what it means to be a human being, right? Like this American myth is not what it means to be a human being, right? So his assertion to me is an assertion about character ultimately. So that's been really interesting to me to see that these notions of craft, but that emerge at a really sort of concrete and grounded context.
I think that is really interesting, and I guess it makes me wonder because it kind of it redeems craft in my eyes because I just don't even, as you were saying, I don't even feel like I know what we're talking about anymore when we say craft. It's like I would be fine if I just never heard that word again in my life. And I wonder, I guess I'm used to thinking about craft as, at least for me, like thinking about focusing on that during the revision process, like taking a closer look at, how the point of view is working or dialogue or, characterization. But in the way that you're talking about it, it seems like it is much more integral to also kind of maybe the beginning, drafting, imaginative, creating part of the process as well.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Like craft in the way that you were talking about it before in terms of these categories of, revision, description, point of view, dialogue. I think that stuff probably is more about revision, like technicalities. Maybe craft in the way that I'm talking about it, like the other sense of craft is more about a sensibility, right? More about what you want writing to do, who you're writing for, like Richard Wright is a really good example. Really huge writer and when Native Son came out in the 1940s, but then it's kind of fallen out of favor. And the reasons are because people feel like it's overdetermined and Bigger Thomas is not a real character, and so on and so forth. But you look around like now in 2020 and you're like, you know what? Life is overdetermined sometimes. So maybe you need a Bigger Thomas character sometimes because what we're experiencing right now is ridiculous, right? So I just think we can sort of get into these abstractions about what good writing is and what bad writing is. And, Richard Wright is a bad writer now, maybe a lot of people would say. But when I reread Native Son for this class, I was riveted and it really felt current. It felt like a book for now, and that's another thing. I heard my friend Somaj Sharif say this once, this whole idea of like writing work that will last, writing work that will, be here forever. And thinking about the possibility of that being an arrogant stance, perhaps, and maybe the better stance being writing for now, writing because you're going to die, right? No, writing because that other people are going to die, and just sort of being really pressed up against the moment that you're living in, and what kind of writing emerges out of that.
That seems very intense. Like,
Yeah.
are you able to like sustain that in like an everyday sort of like writing practice? Like, how do you do that?
What's funny about this is that someone asked her exactly the same question when she said it. and she said, if I remember correctly, she admitted that it's like can be brutal. it can be really hard on you. And that, there's a way in which you do have to look out for yourself. And, maybe what we call self-care is part of this, but there's also maybe a bigger value of just caring outwardly, caring for the world, caring for, what is going to happen to your family, to your people, to, this country, to the globe, thinking of like climate change. So yeah, it can be hard on you as an individual, and I think you have to find a balance. But also, we're in trouble. Like the world is in trouble right now. And I think that's important to keep that in mind too.
You mentioned that you are teaching now. How does teaching work or not work? I mean, I assume it works for the most part alongside your writing practice. Like, how does it feed into it?
Yeah, the honest answer is that I'm not writing right now, which I kind of expected because this is a new teaching job and I'm sort of getting my bearings and getting a sense of the rhythms and everything. And it's particularly strange having, doing everything over Zoom. But you know what? I've always liked teaching. I've taught on many different levels for several years now. And at the same time that I do think it's draining if you're really committed to it, and it sort of maybe pulls from some of the same pool of energy that you need to write. I also feel like I feel excited by the work that I'm reading, thinking with the work, thinking about the work. Even though I'm not physically writing right now, I feel like I'm thinking about my work. And I know that once I figure out my routine here and I do actually get back to the page, I know that the thinking that I've been doing and the kinds of conversations we've been having in class will contribute in, I think, a good way to my actual, writing of words and sentences. But that said, I'm not writing right now, so that's just the truth.
Can I still ask you a question about the novel that you were writing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that the question, or do you have?
I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
So you earlier this evening, you talked a little bit when we were talking about endings about kind of about the short story in kind of conceptualized as like as an object almost. And I guess I wonder how, like, does it feel this, or how is it different working on a novel in terms of like how you conceptualize it? Like, is it also like an object that you can hold and like comb things through? Is it something that you like, how is it different shape-wise? How is the process different? I'm asking also selfishly because I'm having written short stories, I've been trying to work on a novel, and it's a real disaster.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. In fact, I'm so with you that my so-called novel has taken a back seat to what might be another collection of stories. That said, though, I do want to answer your question. And I think the work that I've done on it so far definitely feels like the work of someone who's gotten used to writing short stories. So I sort of like find myself, kind of clawing my way through the same territory and kind of trying to get that right before I move on. And when I was on fellowship at Stanford, one of my writing teachers was like, just stop doing that. Just keep going forward and just get something, no matter how messy it is, just kind of get a draft out. The other thing that I would mention that I think is useful, I sat in this summer, Ian Lee did a class with A Public Space, the journal, this summer on Zoom. And it was about writing a novel, scaffolding a novel, I think was the title of it. And she said that when she was in graduate school, she went to one of her teachers. She was trying to write her first novel and was having trouble. And she said, well, how do I do this? I just don't know how to do this. And her teacher said, well, how many parts does your novel have? And she was like, well, what do you mean parts? And he was like, well, you have this novel, and even if at the end of the process, this whole notion of parts disappears, like there's no page that says part 1, part 2, part 3. In writing it, to help you write it, think of it in parts. Like think of like how much time your novel is going to cover and how you're slicing that time up. Think about what defines each part. Is each part going to be defined by a public event that happens? So there's a wedding in part 1 and execution in part 2 and a funeral in part 3, whatever. This is random. And I really like that idea because I think it immediately snapped into place something that I was just having trouble doing, which is like, well, how do you conceptualize something as large as a novel? It's hundreds of pages. That's crazy. But if you think of it in parts, if you think of it as like, this is a 75-page part, this is like a part that's centered on this event or centered on this whatever. And the next part is this, and the next part is this, then that feels more manageable to me, especially as a short story writer. And I'm assuming that's going to help me. I can't proclaim that it's been tested by me and proven to be true, but it immediately made sense and immediately, brought some things, clarified some things for me in thinking about my book. So maybe that's helpful. I don't know.
Have there also been kind of other I guess also it could be books, but other forms of art or media that you've been absorbing that may or may not be part of this fallow period?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I would say, and I think it's because I'm teaching this class and because I was preparing to teach this class over the summer, but music absolutely has come to the fore. And thinking about what music can do and how writing can approach music and how musical forms or musical shapes or musical notions can replicate things that we do traditionally in writing. So for example, this past week I taught a short story by Ann Petrie, who wrote The Street. The story is called Solo on the Drums. Yeah. And so much of the action of the story is repetition, just sort of repeating key terms, but repetition with a difference, or, some people call it worrying the line, or like the changing scene. There are a lot of names for it. But it's how you can achieve the same intensity that you have in, for example, a scene as traditionally defined, by using something like repetition that accrues and that changes and that gets bigger each time you repeat the thing that happened. So I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in like listening to music and thinking about how it makes me feel and what, the different aspects of the music are doing to me and how, it's maybe possible to approach those things in writing. A lot of jazz, a lot of blues, hip hop. Yeah.
Do you listen to music usually while you're writing?
I don't usually. And if I do, it's probably wordless music because I just get distracted by the lyrics and wanting to sort of follow along what's been saying. So I probably wouldn't listen to like Billie Holiday as much as I love Billie Holiday, but I probably would listen to like Miles Davis, or someone like that. Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, maybe a couple more questions before we go to audience questions.
Yeah.
How has How is your writing, I guess both the actual texts and your own process and thinking about it, how has it evolved over, I don't know, the last, whatever it is, decade or however many years you want to talk about?
Yeah, that's a good question. How has it evolved? I mean, I think, well, one thing I've noticed, and I don't know if this is something that is a definitive trend or something that will last. Earlier today, talking with some students, someone was talking about, a faculty member was talking about how my stories tend to be long, which is true. Like these 25, 30-page stories. And my newer work, I've noticed, tends to be a little shorter. Not uniformly. I think maybe the story that came out, one of the stories that came out this summer is probably pretty long still. But some of the other stories are pretty compact for me, which means they're like 20 pages instead of 30 pages. And I'm not sure what that's about. I'm not sure if that'll change in revision. But I don't know if that reflects like a certain kind of urgency that I'm feeling. If it's based on what I'm writing about, because I'm writing maybe more explicitly about things like police murders of African Americans, or deed theft of Black people in New York and other cities, or medical racism, So I don't know if the urgency of those topics is causing the writing to change and to be maybe more direct, more concise, but that's something that I've noticed, and I don't know what's up with that.
But it's exciting, right?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, well, I think we have to, let's go over to the audience questions. We have a bunch here. Okay, so the first question here is, when do you write? Do you write only when urged by the muse, or do you have a routine? If the latter, how does that look?
When I'm writing well, meaning I've sort of I'm in kind of a flow of writing, that means I do roughly have a routine. But it's not super strict, to be honest with you. Like, I'm not one of those people who sets a word count goal for the day. I'm not one of those people who sets like a page goal. For me, it's about time. And if I can devote 2 to 3 hours starting in the morning, sometimes, going into the early afternoon, it's just sitting with my story in process, or just my idea, my notion. Idea isn't the right word. My notion, my inkling, then that feels sufficient to me. Like, if I can just think about my work, that feels like writing to me. And if I can do that like 5 days out of the week, even if I'm actually not getting very many words down, I feel like I'm writing and I feel good. I try not to wait for the muse. I think for me, this is just me. I wouldn't prescribe this to anyone else. I just think you have to show up. You have to show up before the muse shows up. That's kind of how I feel about it, or at least that's the way it's worked for me. If I'm just sort of like lying around and, scrolling on Twitter, the muse is not going to get anywhere near me. But if I sit at the desk and think and feel and look out the window and imagine, then it might not be on the first day or even the 5th day, but eventually something will come. What do you do? I'm just curious.
I mean, I think I've been pretty lax on myself historically, and I mean, which felt okay while I, had full-time jobs. And now, you know, I have so much time and I'm here to write, right? So I did start, you know, trying to block out like this many hours writing, this many hours reading, this many hours translating, which is, I mean, it's definitely way too ambitious, but at least it's not like, I think as you said, you know, I'm not writing for like 3 hours straight. I'm kind of like sitting around and like maybe I'll like walk around the room and think about it and think about what books I should read that are in connection with the writing, and so on. I mean, it's really, it doesn't even get close to like this many hours this many hours this many hours this, but it's like it's more than I've done in the past, so I feel like it's okay.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds good.
Okay, the next audience question is from Michael Ursel. I really appreciate that you were thinking about forms of intimacy throughout the stories for Lucky Man. I was struck by your representation of brothers. What did you learn about what it means to be a sibling as you wrote these stories? What is that kind of intimacy about for you?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's a great question. I think, you know, I have a brother. And I don't know that I ever explicitly set out to write stories about brothers because I have a brother. That wasn't my mindset, really. But I know the fact that I have a brother is part of that. And I think it's just fascinating that, you know, assuming you grew up together, it's just fascinating to me that you can share so much time and experience with someone and have completely different experiences of it. That's really fascinating to me. And maybe it goes back to, you know, these kinds of intimacies that actually feel distant at the same time that you were talking about earlier. I think sibling relationships or brother relationships, whatever, any kind of sibling relationship can be that, where like you are close together, you're pressed close together. My brother and I growing up, we shared a room, you know, we lived we had a bunk bed. So I know what it means to share space with someone for many years and yet feel often really far away from them, really distant from them. And that's such a strange sensation. So I don't know that I've learned anything really, except that I think despite that kind of strange distance and the estrangement that you can sometimes have with your siblings, I think I've maybe just learned, not in the moral of the story kind of way, but just like like just the importance of care, you know, and how easy it is not to care sometimes, how easy it is to sort of, you know, shirk your responsibility or just feel like I'm not responsible for you, and like the harm that can do. You know, so maybe that, just sort of sitting in the really disorienting feeling of being a sibling, of being close, and just at the same time being like a galaxy apart.
I could talk about siblings all day. And I love stories about siblings. I have a sister also.
Oh, You want to drop?
Always thinking about that. All right. So your next question: who is the lucky man of your title? Is such signification meant sincerely, or facetiously?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think at a certain point, I don't remember at what stage, if it was with one of my editors or with my agent, but there was talk of changing the title of the collection to something else. And I insisted on it being A Lucky Man, because even though that title is the title of one specific story in the book, it also, I think, represents all the men in the book. And so if the question is whether it's sincere or if it's ironic or facetious, I think it's both. In the short story, it's certainly both. Someone, that character in that story, Lincoln, is someone who has had great aspirations for himself, and he knew what his life was going to be like, and he had certain notions about what he deserved, and those things did not turn out the way that he wanted them to. And so he ends up ruining what he does have, actually. So in that sense, it's easy to see the irony, right? There's a line in the story where one of his friends is like joking around with him because he's, got like this hot girlfriend, and they're like, you're lucky, you're a lucky man. And Lincoln's thought is, yeah, okay, but actually, I don't think I'm lucky because I think this is exactly what I deserve. So part of that is about like a male sense of entitlement. And in many ways, he's not very lucky at all. But in that story, and I would argue in every single story, even though these characters are going through stuff, and maybe a lot of the stories, the dominant tone is sad, I think there are moments of joy in every single story. Or at least I try to do that. I want that to be in every single story. So in that sense, they're all lucky, right? And to me, that's life, like Baldwin is talking about, no one is innocent. You can't get away clean. We all go through these troubles, right? He has a line in that essay I mentioned earlier, like you can't stand on the shore and say you've been in the ocean, right? And so much of the American mythology is like pretending that you've been in the ocean when in fact all you've been doing is just standing on the sidelines, right? And so I think that every one of those characters undergoes difficulties, all those men in the stories, but all those characters also have moments of happiness, genuine moments of happiness. And for that reason, they are actually non-ironically lucky, I think.
I really like that, because that means, hopefully all of us here have had that too. And we
Yeah.
are all lucky,
Yeah, I think so.
All right, your next question. Your work at the sentence level is so sharp and beautiful, like poetry. Do you have any advice for writers wanting to improve their work at the sentence level? It seems like something that may perhaps be intuitive, but do you think this can be improved or taught?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is embedded in the question, actually. Read poetry. I mean, that sounds like silly or a throwaway or maybe like, cliche because it's said so often, but I think it's true. And this actually connects up to my routine, the question about my routine that came up earlier. Part of my routine is sitting with a book, usually poetry, on my desk that I can just flip open and read a poem, a couple of poems, just to see language working with that kind of intensity, that kind of musical intensity and that kind of emotional intensity. Seeing how pauses work, right? Either by punctuation or the line. That's really important to me. And so, like I'm always kind of dissatisfied with my sentences and like I'm like always editing things that have already been published. But I think if you make it a practice to read poetry, it can be transformative. Quick example. So this week in my craft class, we read Maud Martha by Gwendolyn Brooks. And that's her only novel. She's a poet. She's the first African-American to win the Pulitzer Prize in poetry, to win a Pulitzer Prize, period. But you can tell, even though this is a novel, that this is the work of a poet because the sentences are so musical and so like you can just hear them even if you read them silently. They're so beautifully crafted. And I think you can train your ear by exposing yourself to work that focuses on language on that level, the sentence level, the phrase level, the word level.
And I think I just want to say, I think you can hear that also when you when you read your work out loud, you know, as even at the beginning, you know, the passage that you read is, and I think that's a helpful thing for everyone to do, is to read your own work out loud.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Okay, we have a question from Karen Gu.
you.
She asks, can you talk about what you think the short story form can do that the novel can't do?
Yeah.
And this will be the last question.
Okay, cool. I think the quick answer for me would be that short stories feel like they lean towards poetry, actually. They feel like they lean towards poems. So even though I write these long stories, like 25, 30 pages, they still feel like these intense units. It feels like, you know, we were talking about the challenges of holding a novel in your head all at the same time. I think even after you've written a novel or read a novel, it can be hard to hold it in your head the entire time. But a story, I think you can, or you can get a lot closer to it, where you feel like you've just had this glimpse of someone's life. And it sort of strikes you with like concentrated force. That's what I think a short story can do. It can just sort of give you a glimpse of a life, and it feels like you can kind of understand a person just by that glimpse, you know. It feels, I don't know, for me, it feels like a really urban form for some reason, because like you're always passing people like in the street or whatever, and you kind of get a sense of who they are. You can kind of look at them for a few seconds and then they're gone. That's kind of like what a story feels like to me. Like you kind of get this concentrated look at someone's life and then they're gone. But there's a resonance, and that's what's powerful.
Thank you so much. So I guess we are ending there. I want to thank you, Jamel, for reading and for conversation and for answering all of these questions. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Don't forget to buy the book. And I think that's all. Thanks, BMI.
Thank you.
Thank
you to our guest, Jamel, and our moderator, Bonnie. Thank you to all the attendees in Las Vegas and Reno and beyond. And an extra big thank you to Nevada Humanities and the National Endowment for Humanities for making this program possible. Ugh.